Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about aperture and I'm going to try and help you understand what aperture is, how to control aperture in your camera, how it affects your image quality both creatively and technically in terms of sharpness and depth of field. Also, we're going to look at bokeh, the out of focus areas and how that's rendered. And then we're going to talk about sort of the pros and cons of using different apertures. So with that said, let's get started. So what is aperture and what does aperture do? Well, essentially, it controls the amount of light coming into your camera through the lens and eventually hitting the sensor. And it's one of the major components in the exposure triangle when you're trying to control the exposure through aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. Now to control the aperture on your camera, you need to go to your mode dial where there's a P, A, S, and M. And on some cameras, it'll be P, AV, TV, and M, but it's basically the same thing. So turn your camera into the A or aperture priority mode, and this will give you full control of the aperture on your camera, but the camera will take care of the other exposure elements like shutter speed and ISO, assuming you're in auto ISO mode. And once you're in A mode, you can control the aperture via the front dial or rear dial, and some cameras actually have an aperture ring on the lens itself. But however you control the aperture in your camera, you need to be in A or AV mode. You can also control the aperture by going into full manual mode. And again, you would control it via the front or rear dial or the lens, depending on your camera. But in this case, you will take control of the shutter speed and ISO in full manual mode, rather than letting the camera control those elements when you're getting your exposure. Now, the other thing you need to understand is what are the aperture specifications of your lens? Because every lens can have a different aperture specification, thereby affecting the values that you can actually set in your camera. Now, the maximum aperture is usually printed right on the front of the lens or on the side of the lens. So let's take a closer look. So taking a close look at the front of this lens, we can see it's a 25mm, and then next to it they listed the maximum aperture as 1:1.8. So all we really need to look at is the 1.8, and this is commonly referred to as f1.8. So that is the maximum aperture for this lens, and it's a fixed aperture because it's a fixed focal length. On zoom lenses, a lot of times you'll see a variable aperture, meaning f3.5 to f5.6. So at 14mm, we're going to have a maximum aperture of f3.5, and at 42mm, we're going to have a maximum aperture of f5.6. So the aperture is going to vary as we zoom in or out between 14 and 42, between f3.5 and f5.6. So what does maximum aperture mean? What is f1.8? Well, basically it's telling us how large is the hole inside the lens to allow the amount of light to come into the camera to hit the sensor. So let's take a look at this diagram. So if we look at the front of this lens, we'll see a little hole here where light will pass through. And depending on the size of this hole will dictate how much light will go through the lens and eventually hit the sensor. And this hole is adjustable. Now looking inside the lens, this is how we control the size of the hole in the lens through what we call, these are the aperture blades, and these can be adjusted or open and closed. Now on this lens, it actually has an aperture ring that we can adjust the aperture blades inside the lens. On most cameras now, this is done electronically, like I showed you earlier, through aperture mode and using the front and rear dials. But as you can see, as we're controlling the blades, we're controlling the apertures. So this is actually a minimum aperture where we have the smallest hole, and then opening the lens up, this is the maximum aperture where the blades are completely open. Now looking at this lens, we can see that it has a maximum aperture of f1.4. So this is the most amount of light that we can allow into this lens. And as we stop the lens down, meaning make the hole smaller in the lens, the aperture numbers actually get larger. So there is an inverse relationship between the size of the opening from the iris and the aperture number. So as the hole gets smaller, the aperture number gets larger. Now it's important to understand the relationship of these aperture numbers versus how much light we're letting into the camera. So obviously when we have the aperture wide open here, we're letting the most amount of light in versus the smaller hole where we're letting the least amount of light in. If we were to start here at f5.6, just in the middle, and we want to let more light in, we would go down to f4. This will let twice as much light in. And if we go down again from f5.6 to f2.8, this is actually 4 times as much light than f5.6. And this is typically referred to as stopping up the lens because we're letting in more light. Inversely, when we start at f5.6 and we go to f8, we're cutting the light in half. And if we go to f11, we're cutting the light by 1/4 relative to f5.6. And this is typically referred to as stopping the lens down. So down is less light, up is more light. And to kind of give you an idea of the overall scale of this aperture range, let's say we start at f22. This is letting a certain amount of light in. We'll just call that 1. When we go to f16, we're letting in twice as much light. If we were to go from f22 down to f11, we're letting 4 times as much light. And then we double it again to f8, we're letting in 8 times as much light versus f22. And if we just carry this out, you can see this rises very quickly. So f1.4 is letting in 256 times more light than f22. And then obviously, hopefully, and I know I didn't want to do it first because of fractions, but if we start at f1.4 with a certain amount of light, we'll call that 1. f2 is going to cut the light in half. From f1.4 to f2.8, we're cutting the light by 1/4. And then we go to 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/64, 1/128, and we're back to 256. So this is letting in 256 times less light than f1.4. I want to pause here and just explain what a stop is, because we use this word a lot in photography. Like we'll say stop the lens down, or we might say stop your shutter speed down by 2 stops, or adjust your exposure by 3 stops when we're doing exposure compensation. A stop, all that means is we are either doubling the light or we're cutting the light in half. So we're making it brighter twice by 2x, or we're cutting the light in half like so. And that's all a stop is. And all of the exposure variables are indexed in terms of stops. Now, unlike shutter speed and ISO, because ISO is indexed like this, right, in nice linear numbers. So 100, 200, 400, 200 is twice as bright as 100, 400 is 4 times as bright as 100, etc. And of course, shutter speed, let's say we have 1/60th of a second, and we go to 1/30th of a second, we're letting twice as much light, so this is 1 stop. But when we're looking at aperture numbers, this is not very linear. And that's because these numbers are actually a ratio of the size of the hole relative to the size of the front element of the lens. So without going into all of the math, I'm going to show you a quick way to draw this aperture scale out, because eventually you'll just memorize this and this will become very natural to you, just like counting from 1 to 10. But a little quick trick is all you have to remember are these 2 numbers, 1.4 and 2. So if we start at 1.4, we double that, we get 2.8. We double that, we get 5.6. We double that, we get 11.2, but we just round it in photography. And we double that, we get 22. And then we take 2.0, we put that here, we double that, we get 4. We double that, we get 8. We double that, we get 16. And now I've built out the entire aperture scale. So it's just an easy way to kind of remember or build it out. until you actually memorize these numbers. Now, you don't have to memorize these numbers because, like I said, over time, they'll just become second nature and you'll know them like the back of your hand. But our cameras are capable of indexing in thirds of a stop, half a stop, etc. So you might be able to set your camera at f2.8 and say, oh, I just need a little bit less light, and you can go to f3.2. But hopefully now you understand that from f2.8 to f3.2 is only 1/3 of a stop, or 1/3 less light than f2.8, because we know that a full stop is from f2.8 to f4. Now that we have all that out of the way, let's get into the fun stuff and talk about how aperture affects your depth of field, your bokeh, and image quality. Now, when we're talking about depth of field, we commonly say we have a shallow depth of field or we have a very deep depth of field. And a shallow depth of field is when we have a very narrow area in the image in focus, but everything in front of and behind this area will be out of focus. And a deep depth of field is when we have everything in focus from the closest point in the camera all the way to the furthest point. And smaller aperture numbers typically give us a shallower depth of field, and higher aperture numbers give us a deeper depth of field, and of course everything in between. Now, aperture is only one variable of several that affect depth of field, and we'll talk about those. But let's take a closer look at the relationship between these aperture numbers and depth of field. Now, unlike when we were talking about the amount of light passing through the lens, when we're talking about depth of field, aperture is only one variable when it comes to calculating the depth of field. So let's say, for example, I'm standing here with my camera, and this is a field, and I want to take a picture of this tree here. And I only want the tree in focus. Well, basically what I'm saying is I want to try to get as shallow depth of field as possible so that only the tree is in focus. So I'm going to pick the widest aperture I can, and on this scale it'll be 1.4. And then I'm going to focus on the tree, and in practice, and this is just a rule of thumb, but about 1/3 of the distance in front of the tree will be in focus, and roughly 2/3 behind the tree will stay in focus. And this is the depth of field area here between these 2 points. So everything should be in focus, or what they like to say, acceptably sharp. And then once we get past that point, things will begin to blur out in that direction. And then actually, there's going to be areas here blurry in front of the tree up to the point to where you're standing. And this is just a rule of thumb, because the other things that affect depth of field are distance and the focal length of your lens. All right, now let's take a look at a real life example as we stop the lens down at what happens to the background. Now, right now we're going to start wide open at f1.8. And as I stop the lens down, watch the background here behind this bokeh. See how it becomes more and more in focus? And then going in reverse, from f22, you can see as we stop the lens up, back to f1.8, the background becomes out of focus. Now looking at the extremes, this is wide open at f1.8, so we get a very shallow depth of field. And this was the minimum aperture, f22 for this lens. And you can see everything in the background is pretty much in focus. So there are reasons we want to use a shallow depth of field versus a deep depth of field. For shallow depths of field, it's usually because we want to isolate the subject from the rest of the environment. So in this case, our focus is here on my dog, and then everything else in the frame really doesn't matter. So we can blur that out, and by being blurry, it doesn't give our eyes anywhere to go to in the rest of the frame, so we can focus just on the main subject. Conversely, when we use a deep depth of field, we want to see everything. We want to see the dock here going out, and the pier, the background, the sunset, all the clouds. This is when we want to see all the details and have everything in focus. So we're going to use a higher aperture number to achieve this. Now, another interesting effect that aperture settings can have on your image is when you use a very high aperture, usually the minimum aperture, say f/22, you get this starburst effect that you see here. Because what happens, remember how at f/22 we have a very small opening inside the lens. So what's happening is the light has to bend around this very small opening before it goes on to the sensor here, for example. And that's what's helping to create this starburst effect. And just another tip to help amplify this effect, usually it's helpful to have the light bending around another object. So in this case, I have the sun already kind of bending around the Washington Monument here. And then I set my aperture very, very small at f/22 to have the light bend again around the aperture blades. And of course, again, with a high aperture number, we're going to get everything in focus. Here in the foreground, you can see all of the flags all the way around the monument, and of course the monument itself. So here's a good example of using the aperture to control your depth of field and to help you remove distracting elements. So if we're comparing this image on the left to the image on the right, I think we'll all agree that this image on the left is a little more pleasing because our eye can focus on just the flower and not on any of the distracting elements that might be around the flower. Unlike this picture on the right, all of its own leaves and everything draws our eyes all over the frame, versus the image on the left here, our eyes are primarily drawn right here, and there's really no place else to go because it's all out of focus. Now, when we're choosing a deep depth of field, it's typically because we want to keep all of the details in the image to help tell the story. So in this scene, obviously, we have the train tracks. I want them all in focus to help lead our eyes into the frame. And then I want the building here, which is actually the main subject, to be completely in focus. And of course, the leaves and the sky and everything in the background also in focus to help tell a story or the time and place that this particular scene is at. And deep depths of field are more common like in street photography and documentary type photography, where you want to see the subject in its environment and what's going on around them. And a quick couple examples of shallow depth of field. Typically, you want to use shallow depths of fields on smaller subjects like portraits in this case, or maybe birds and animals. Anywhere where the subject is very important and the rest of the scene probably is not. Because portraits, right, are always about the person. And of course, animal and wildlife is always about the animal and what they're doing. Whereas deep depths of field, landscapes, very large scenes, typically you want everything in focus, like in this image of the Great Falls. Or typically I use deep depths of field when I'm doing architectural type photography. This is what I do for a living here. I want to give the viewer a sense of space and all of the details and everything that's in the scene, in this case a kitchen, so that it'll help them make a buying decision. Now remember when I mentioned that aperture is really only one variable when it comes to calculating or achieving the depth of field that you want. Focal length and distance also play a major role. So just rule of thumb, typically long lenses, telephoto lenses like 300 millimeters, will give you a shallower depth of field. And wide angle lenses like 12 millimeters will typically give you a very deep depth of field. However, when I'm changing my distance, I can affect the depth of field as well. So here's the lens, 300 millimeters at f8. And if we look closely at this image, you can see that virtually everything is in focus, from the front of the plane all the way to the background. All the grass and everything is in focus. It's just a little blurry here maybe, but for the most part, this is a pretty deep depth of field. Versus using the same lens and the same aperture, if I get much closer to the subject, I can achieve a very shallow depth of field. Even though I haven't changed the focal length or the aperture, all I've changed is my distance. And the same thing holds true even for wide angle lenses. Because even though I chose a very small aperture number here, I was using a wide angle lens and everything is still in focus. And I was probably only about a foot behind this little support here. But when we use that same lens and same aperture, but I get just a few inches away from the subject, you can see that I was still able to achieve a very shallow depth of field. And again, all I did was change my distance. Now, sometimes when it comes to depth of field, the aperture won't matter. Take a look at this image here, for example. If you had to kind of guess what aperture and focal length did I use to take this image, you probably wouldn't have guessed I used like f2 and a telephoto or semi-telephoto lens, because in this case, what I actually used was a 75 millimeter at f2. And normally you would intuitively probably think that'd give me a very shallow depth of field where only this pier here would be in focus, and yet everything's in focus, right? And that's because of the other variable that we talked about. I'm at a pretty good distance from this scene, so I know that all of this is going to be in focus. However, if I had chosen, say, f4 or f8, aperture in this case still wouldn't have made any difference. It wouldn't have changed how this image looked. Everything would still be in focus. But the reason I chose f2 in this case is because I need to gather as much light as I can so I can use a faster shutter speed and or lower ISO, because I was hand holding when I took this image. So because I had such a good distance, I was able to choose a lower aperture, maintain my very deep depth of field, and get the shot that I want handheld. Now there's one other variable I haven't talked about yet when it comes to depth of field, and that is the sensor size. And I didn't mention up to this point because sensor size is not something you can adjust in the field, for example, right? You have one camera, but you can have multiple lenses, but you're pretty much stuck with the sensor size that you have. But rule of thumb is larger sensors give you a shallower depth of field, smaller sensors give you a deeper depth of field. So larger sensor cameras, a lot of times like medium format or full frame, are very popular with portrait and wedding photographers. Cameras like Micro Four Thirds that I use are very popular for architectural, astrophotography, where you have very deep depths of field and you're able to use lower ISOs and faster apertures, faster shutter speeds, etc. to achieve the same amount of light that you would need, say, from a full frame camera. But there are calculators online that will help you determine what the depth of field is. And these are useful tools. I would just use them as guidelines to help you get started and understand. But nothing's going to replace you going out in the field and practicing with your own camera and lens to see what kinds of depth of fields that you get with various aperture, focal lengths, and cameras, right? Depending on the camera you have. But let me show you one site that's really good. And that's the PhotoPills. So just Google PhotoPills depth of field calculator, and it'll take you right to this page where you can actually put in your camera model. And if they don't have your exact camera model, just pick one that has the same sensor size. And then you can put in the focal length and the aperture and the distance to the subject, and then it'll give you all of the data here. And again, use this as a guideline. This is not hard and fast numbers because there's another variable that comes into play, and that is how large is the final image going to be. So are you going to show this on your cell phone or laptop, iPad, or are you going to be showing this on an 8x10 print? Your effective depth of field is going to be deeper than, say, if you were to show that same image on a billboard or poster or something much larger. So just keep that in mind when you're practicing. You want to practice with your camera and lens combination and also print or display the images on the medium that you use the most or wherever you're going to be delivering it, because the depth of field can effectively change depending even on the output size. And actually the calculator that I showed you has adjustments for that as well. Now let's talk about the out of focus areas, also known as the bokeh, that can be rendered using various apertures. And the bokeh is affected a lot of times by the number of aperture blades you have and the shape of those aperture blades. So let's look at a couple of examples. Now when we look at this image on here on the left, you can see that the out of focus area, which is everything in this case, we have very nice smooth round circles here. Sometimes people call them bokeh balls, but these bokeh circles are very, very round and nice and smooth and creamy, versus the image here on the right you can see we have more of a hexagonal shape where we have straight edges and corners. And most people would find this more pleasing. Some people like the effect over here, but either way, this is directly related to the aperture blades in the lens. So if we look at the aperture blades for that image on the left, you can see that as we stop the lens down, the aperture blades are very, very round. And of course, when we go wide open, they're going to stay round. Versus the aperture blades here on the right, you can almost see the hexagonal shape being created because this lens here only has 6 aperture blades, whereas this one, I think it has 11 blades. So there's a big difference in how these two lenses render the out of focus areas. Again, nice and round and smooth versus more hexagonal. Now let's look at another example. If we look at this image here and we inspect the out of focus area, you can see that we do have very smooth and creamy bokeh in the background and nice sharp focus here in the front. No problems here. But let's look at the image next to it, which is virtually the same image. Look at the bokeh here. See how it gets a little bit busier up here? Especially over here on the right. It's very, very distracting and very busy. We got sort of horizontal lines going through it. We got some busyness going on in here. And even the image here in the center is not very sharp. And that has partially to do with the aperture blades themselves, kind of create this busyness in the background. But these diagonal lines that you see over here are caused by a different problem in the lens. So what I'm referring to now is actually the quality of the lens itself. The design of the lens, the manufacturing process involved, because typically consumer grade lenses don't have the same tolerances and quality of glass and quality control that a professional grade lens would have. And the image that you just saw with all of the problems in the out of focus area was a consumer grade lens. And what's happening there is partially due to the aperture blade and the design, but also the way they polish the lenses. They need to polish the lenses very, very smooth so that you don't get these kinds of artifacts in your out of focus areas. So when you're looking for lenses or shopping lenses and the out of focus area is important to you, then you need to look at tests other than just for sharpness. You need to look for a lot of other things. And I'll do another video on lenses where we'll go into more detail about that. But for the purposes of this video, generally speaking, prime lenses give you smoother bokeh normally and better quality out of focus areas versus zoom lenses. They typically give you worse out of focus areas, more problems like the ones I just showed you. And that's going to hold true up until you get to the very premium like pro grade type glass, where they do take the time to polish and, you know, the manufacturing process, all of that. Now let's talk about the opposite of out of focus. Let's talk about problems that we can run into with the in focus areas when we choose different apertures. Now, when we're not worried about the out of focus areas, but we want to focus on just the in focus areas, typically like landscapes like this image, there are pros and cons to choosing different apertures. Because like I said, the aperture is part of the exposure triangle, so it can have an effect on our exposure and shutter speed and ISO, but also it can affect the sharpness of the lens, and it also can cause aberrations when we choose the wrong aperture. Now let's look at this image here, and I want us to just kind of focus right over here on the corner. I took this image twice, and I didn't change camera lens or my distance or the focus. All I did was change the aperture, and I took this one at 0.95, and I took this image over here at f4. Now this is not a depth of field problem because, again, I was very far away from this tree, but look at the difference in the image quality. Particularly, I like to show the corners because that's where it's worst, but this effect goes on across the entire frame. But see how much purple aberrations we have on this particular branch and how soft everything is around it versus over here. Most of the purple's gone away. There's still a little bit of purple fringing and aberrations up in here, but this image over here, or this part of the image, is much, much sharper. And all we did was just choose a different aperture. And fortunately, in this case, aperture doesn't really matter for this image because we're not going for a shallow depth of field. So in these kind of situations, you typically want to choose the best aperture for that lens to give you the sharpest image corner to corner. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking, well, if a higher aperture gives us a sharper image, why don't we just choose a much higher aperture like f/16? Well, choosing higher apertures introduces another problem called diffraction. And hopefully you can see how much sharper this image is at f4 than it is at f/16. And this is a problem I see time to time with people that even have these very high megapixel cameras, like 60 megapixels, but they're shooting at like f/16, and they may not realize that they're cutting their resolution probably down to about 12 megapixels when they're shooting at these very high apertures. Now I wanted to show you this chart because this is an example of a typical 50mm lens and the sharpness across the different aperture numbers. And as you can see, wide open here at f1.8, the corners are very, very soft, which I showed you previously, and the center is pretty good, but it's not as good as, say, f4. When we stop down, you can see the sharpness in the center goes up, way up, and there's also a good improvement in the corners of the image, the green area here. And then going to f5.6, tiny bit more on both the center and the corners. But look at f8. f8 is where we have the corners at their sharpest, and we also have very, very good sharpness here in the center. And this is why a lot of times people will choose f8 to be their sharpest aperture for their lens. And that's true for a lot of lenses. But all lenses are different, and you'll have to do a lot of testing on your own camera and lens combination to see which aperture gives you the sharpest results in the center, in the corner, and then all over the entire frame. So let's go back to this image here, which I took at f8, because I knew that with that lens and camera combination, I would get the sharpest image corner to corner. And if we punch in, and I'm going to tell you a little funny story with this one too. But let's go up here a little bit. If you look closely, you might just see a couple of rock climbers here. And now this tree, if I zoom out, this tree is easily 50 or 60 feet tall. And punching back in, you can see up here we have some more rock climbers. And then over here, we have a rock climber here wearing a blue shirt and brown pants. And believe it or not, somehow this guy found my picture online and said, "Hey, that's me climbing the rock there in the blue shirt. Can you send me a copy of that?" Because he said when he was up here, he was looking down and he saw somebody shooting a wedding. And he was looking for the photographer that was shooting the wedding just in case they happened to get a snapshot of him climbing the mountain. And I wasn't shooting the wedding, but I was shooting this mountain. And gosh, it's just really, really big coincidence that he was able to find me. So I sent him a picture, and that was pretty awesome. So as you can see, choosing the right aperture can be very important, whether you're trying to go for a shallow depth of field, a deep depth of field, or you're trying to maximize sharpness and avoid those kinds of aberrations. And hopefully now you have a little better understanding of what aperture is, how and why it works, and how to choose the right aperture for the scene that you're trying to capture and tell your story. So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you like these kind of videos. If so, consider subscribing, hit the like button. Maybe you want to buy me a coffee. There'll be links down below for that to donate and stuff. But either way, I really appreciate you watching, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.